any comments around that?
Yeah, I feel like the Course is bringing us to this experience that in order to have peace of mind, we have to raise up the ego belief system in the mind and release it, be free of the filters. So you might say that the human condition, like Abraham Maslow had his hierarchy of needs, and sexuality would be right down in those lower basic needs of human beings. And you might say that the very belief in need is egoic. In heaven there are no needs. In oneness or perfection there are no needs. So in terms of sexuality, it's basically part of the perception of being a human being. Hunger and thirst, sexuality, there's things that psychologists like Maslow would say those are basic needs, and then as those needs are fulfilled fairly regularly, then the mind can kind of raise up a bit and advance into higher order needs, and he would call that self-actualization. You might find on the way up a deeper intimacy, a need for deeper intimacy, and then ultimately to remember who you are as a spirit. That would be at the top of the pyramid. So none of those things can be ignored. So when we teach the Course, we're really teaching about the process of forgiveness and the teachings of forgiveness, how this is applied in your mind, giving great instructions and details. But in terms of sexual expression, you might say that sexual expression is our distorted miracle impulses. When Jesus first was dictating the Course in Miracles to Helen Schuckman, he actually didn't use the word sexual impulses at the beginning. He basically said physical impulses are distorted miracle impulses. So that's a much broader category than sexuality and sexual impulses. We could say hunger, thirst, the desire to be warm or cool, or maintain a moderate temperature with the body. All the things that we would say are part of the human condition are part of this distorted miracle impulse, where basically every moment of every day you're being called back to God. You're being called into the miracle. You're being called to forgive. But that miracle impulse, almost like if it was like a beam of light coming, like in our little skit here where the little beam of light was coming into the darkened world, when that beam of light comes through the ego filter, which is one of lack and need, then it comes out on the surface of human consciousness as cravings and needs. So even when we're hungry, that's God calling. When we have sexual desire, that's God calling. When we're getting tired and fatigued, that's God calling. When we want stimulation or music or a massage, when we're thirsty, that's God calling. The miracle impulse, it would be like a beam of light coming, calling us home, calling us to return back to heaven. And when it comes through the filter of the ego, it just comes out on the surface as, I need this, I need that, I want this, I want that. So I've already mentioned, like the 23rd Psalm in the Bible, written by David, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." As long as the mind believes in the ego, of course there's wanting, because the ego is the belief system in lack. That's where the wanting comes from. There's no wanting in heaven. But you have to work with the Holy Spirit and Jesus on really clearing that belief system in lack, so that you can experience those miracle impulses directly, not through the filter. And what would that be if you experienced it directly? Well, there's all kinds of prompts and guidances of what to say, what to do, how to be truly helpful. That's like the prayer at the beginning of the Course, I'm here only to be truly helpful. That's why we're called, through A Course in Miracles, to be miracle workers. And the form of that miracle working doesn't really matter. You're involved with lots of different activities and kind of a panorama of people here in Africa, and coalitions and so on and so forth. And I I've had phases in my life where I was doing a lot of social work and a lot of collaborations along those lines, and I see now how that was just part of me opening my mind, releasing all judgments, learning to be all-inclusive in my love, and also being able to be put in a lot of different circumstances and positions where I could be truly helpful. And ultimately, it goes from trying to be helpful as a person in the world, helping other people, which is more what the social services are about, to starting to realize, oh, I have a perceptual problem, I'm looking through a darkened glass, I'm perceiving the world through the ego's filter, and I'm not experiencing my Christ self, which is the answer to all problems of the world. It's an identity confusion is really what the only problem is lost or forgotten identity. And so I find myself, kind of being used in many places around the world in this way of teaching true forgiveness. And as you know from these 5 or 6 days, we teach mainly by our attitude. If our attitude doesn't back up our words, then that's just more hypocritical presentations. We can't go around and telling people to forgive if we still hold grievances. We can't tell people stop judging if we're still judging. And actually we start to realize that we need the guidance of the Holy Spirit to judge through us, to help us in practical ways, to be used as the light of the world, until we can let it go completely, until we can just completely let go of all judgment, which would be called awakening or enlightenment or self-realization, or Mazo would call it self-actualization, finally being who you are. So I feel like it's kind of interesting because for us, myself and for the messengers, for the areas where we've had interest, like with movies and audio visual, you can see putting together a montage like this was just an expression using our areas of interest or our skill levels and so on and so forth. And a lot of times, too, Ruth was bringing up music today. She was asking, can I access a lot of the music that you play? Kirsten maybe even could share a little bit about the Living Miracle Studio. We actually have bands that have sprung up inspired by our teachings. Entire bands spring up, traveling bands inspired by what we do, and they receive all this divine, beautiful, inspired lyrics and inspired music, and they perform. We have an annual music and enlightenment festival. This year we added a film festival, a metaphysical film festival, to our music and enlightenment festival. So we had music, enlightenment, and film festival this year out at our monastery in the canyon. But and the story of Kirsten learning, basically learning to play the guitar in about a year, and then having songs come to her, recording those songs and putting out an album. And on this very tour, the first stop of this tour, we were up in Ireland, and someone said, I'd like to play a song, and Kirsten didn't even bring her guitar across the ocean, and here the person plays the guitar and sings one of her songs off of her album. And it's all been so fast, it was kind of surreal, like, the whole idea of singing, recording an album, and now someone's already been listening to it across the ocean and is spontaneously playing guitar and singing. This man was. So, you can see how the reflections of it just reverberate, like ripple out as you give yourself over to this. And that's why we were saying yesterday, don't try to bring the Course into your worldly life, into your little personality self. Bring your personality self to the presence of love, and then see what the Spirit wants to do. Because the Spirit will then do it through you. The Spirit will sing through you, or speak through you, contact people through you. We are in contact with a lot of different people in a wide range of areas of the human condition, and it's really fun. We have so much fun interacting with all these people, but they're more feeling our love and our presence, and therefore they may come and I may go to, like I went in Colombia to that place where there's a home for children with AIDS, but it was because the director and the assistant director of the home for children with AIDS came to one of my public talks in Colombia, and listened and asked questions and were very curious, and then just said, would you come to our center? And we just went in there. We weren't teaching any metaphysics. We were just the extension of love, going in there, hugging the babies, playing with the children, just letting the love pour through us. Great gift for us. Our hearts were wide open through that day, but just being used in a helpful way. So we're not really into causes in the world. I wouldn't say we're supporting anything, but our love and our forgiveness is so wide and so all-encompassing and all-inclusive that it just allows us to use all these different symbols, and the Spirit uses them, and then we're off to the next set of symbols, and the next, which is a little different from kind of forming a co-op or a community or a coalition with a specific form outcome in mind. We're all about a state of mind. We're all about a state of mind outcome, staying in peace, staying in the joy, and letting the Spirit just come through with whoever we interact with. So that's kind of the way it is, and you can see sexuality is just an aspect of that. With our community, even though it's called A Course in Miracles Monastery, we don't have any vows, so nobody comes taking a vow of poverty, of chastity, of obedience, yet we see the value of the original intentions behind those vows was really poverty is non-possession. Don't be greedy and thinking you have to own and possess people, places, things. Chastity is purity of thought in the dictionary with regard to sexual matters. We would just say we're going for purity of thought, period. Lining up with our spiritual identity and letting that just flow through us in all kinds of ways as we splash around the world. And obedience really to us is not obedience to a person, it's obedience to the Spirit within. And being very loyal, so that peace of mind comes before debating anything, trying to convince anybody. Peace of mind just takes over as the most important thing in our life, because that was the way we were created. And we want to honor God by living as God created us, in spirit, abilities, and we're just opening to the Spirit and saying, use me. Because really, that's all our prayer is. Jenna?
Just related to that point, in the original Ur text, which I assume you...
Let me use the mic.
Yeah, sure.
Please.
Sorry, yeah.
In the original...
I don't know
In the original Ur text, there's a line where Jesus is quoted as saying, the only valid use of sex is procreation. And they took that out. They edited that out in the published version. Which sort of really made me think, like, okay, well, why did he say that, and why did they edit it out? And on one level, the Course is saying everything that the ego created can be used by Spirit, which would include sex. So why was that originally included in the Ur text? And what is your opinion? I mean, are you guys, celibate, or do you participate in? Sorry to ask personal, but it's interesting because I think it's a question that arises in a lot of people's minds. This conflict between sex and spirituality, and well, in order to be spiritual, I need to give up all sexual desire. How do you reconcile this? And what's your opinion about what Jesus actually meant when he said that in the original Ur text?
Yeah, the Ur text, Jesus said that, but he had a lot of stuff to say. There was huge amounts of teachings that came through around sexuality that were edited out of what we call the public version of A Course in Miracles. In fact, some people have joked with me that the public version they call the nuns' version. Because
why were they edited out?
There was so much. Well,
who decided to?
Ken and Helen basically joined with Jesus and everything. There was not only a lot of content around sexuality taken out, which related to more general things like procreation. He even mentions Virginia Woolf by name in the Ur text, and procreation. That's the context that you were giving. But also a lot of stories with Helen and Bill, because Bill was homosexual and Helen was heterosexual, but actually the way that they chose their partners, her husband, and Bill with his partners and so forth, Jesus was using he was relating to them as they basically were the ones that were calling for help. There must be a better way. So the Urtext is more of a full answer to their prayer, including great details about their lives and their issues that were going on. So it's extremely practical in that way when you see it as it was an answer to Helen and Bill's prayer. As for the public version, there are certain themes, I would say, like sexuality, money. There's certain hot button themes that there's an enormous amount of controversy around in this world. And in fact, at the end of Jesus' course, in the clarification of terms, Jesus is basically saying those who seek for controversy will find it, but those that seek for truth, are going to find it as well. I would say again that sexuality does come under distorted miracle impulses. So ultimately, when we say that the Holy Spirit can use anything that the ego made, the ego made the body, the ego made the world, the ego made the cosmos, the stars, the planets, the ego made all the images, and the Holy Spirit neutralized the images, I said yesterday, and basically now the Holy Spirit can use the body and the world in ways that help take us to undoing our belief in linear time and all of the judgment. In terms of, we can't really say that that the ego made only sexuality. The ego made everything of this cosmos. So when we hand that back all over to the Holy Spirit will use everything that the mind believes in, everything that the ego is, to unwind the mind from these beliefs. But basically, I could talk about sexuality along in the same context of talking about food, because there's another one. Those are major issues, food and sexuality. What is the problem with food? What is the problem with sexuality is that they're on a continuum of preferences. Food preferences and sexual preferences, for example. And preferences are judgments. In heaven there aren't food preferences. There's no food to begin with. There are sexual preferences in heaven because there's no bodies. But you see, everything that the ego made, this cosmos of images, of itself it was handled in an instant. The instant it was made, it was all handled. But the ego turns everything into preferences and judgments. And as you mentioned, Jono, the first teaching in the Course, actually the first principle of miracles, the other day you mentioned that there's no order of difficulty in miracles. That's the very first principle of 50. There's no order of difficulty in miracles, and a correlation of no order of difficulty in miracles is that there's no hierarchy of illusions. Well, the reason there's no hierarchy of illusions is because they're all the same. One illusion is the same, it's unreal. You can't have good unreal and bad unreal. You can't have pleasant unreal and unpleasant unreal. Beautiful, we were talking about art, somebody raised art the other day. Beautiful unreal and ugly unreal. You see, you start to put it in that way, you start to realize that's what the trick is all these hierarchies. So ultimately, it's the preferences that the Holy Spirit knows that there's ego preferences. So the Holy Spirit, if you give your heart and soul over and say, use me in the plan of awakening and help me unwind from this judgment, the Holy Spirit will use what you believe in. So, like if you have sexual preferences, we'll say, to be heterosexual or various sexual preferences or various food preferences or various climate preferences or whatever, the Spirit has to use those to unwind you from them all, because you won't know the kingdom of heaven as long as you believe in judgments, and preferences are actually judgments. So we don't try to lead with the form. A lot of times in spirituality, with ashrams and monasteries and convents, you have to take a vow of celibacy, for example, you were asking about, and that would be saying no sex. that's the forbidden thing, as far as celibacy, no sex. But it's still, if you had sexual desires and you were trying to control at the form level, you would just get into repression and denial. And I think a lot of you know that with the Catholic Church, with the priests and everything, and all the problems that they had with children, and I mean the lawsuits, the many lawsuits. For example, with the Catholic Church, it was trying to lead with the form and hoping that the consciousness will follow. And Jesus is not teaching us in the Course to lead with the form and hope our consciousness will follow. He's saying, work with me, do these daily lessons, keep practicing at forgiveness, and then, lo and behold, your mind will be purified. That's, miracles are everyone's right, but purification is necessary first. So it's a purification from the inside, so to speak, from within your consciousness, and then your behavior just follows from that. And the Course is not judging the behavior at all, not judging that this is better than that. Now, I think if the Course was more, had broader use and broader appeal than the public version already has, there might be something that would go in there about procreation, but it was edited out. It basically, you have to come to a certain level of readiness and awareness, I think, just to even make use of the Course.
Maybe everyone wouldn't have read it then. You can't do that. Sorry.
But what it is there has been so many opinions around what you're bringing up, because there were those that knew Helen and some of her prejudices and predispositions and so forth, and people have said to me everything from, Helen's ego filter was getting in the way with a lot of that stuff, so it had to be edited out. There's some really good stuff in the text, but it takes a lot of discernment, a certain level of mind training and discernment to be able to use that stuff. The ego can take anything in form and turn it into controversy and twist it. What I do say about the text is for example, there was one line that was in the text that was taken out of the published version with good reason, and I use this as a teaching example. There was a line in the text where Jesus supposedly had said God created time as a learning device. Well, if anybody knows the metaphysics of A Course in Miracles, if God created time, then the whole teachings of the Course in Miracles are out, because you can't forgive something that God creates. In other words, God creates Christ, and you can't forgive Christ because Christ is beyond forgiveness. Christ is literally a pure being of love and light. So if God created time, that would mean that time would be beyond forgiveness, and then this would be reality. You'd be stuck in hell forever if God created time as a learning device. So that's one where Ken and Helen took it out. And I use that as a specific example because sometimes people will read the text as if it's the God's truth, and they'll throw everything else out, and I'll say, you better have some mind training before you go digging into these things, because otherwise most people can see that directly contradicts the metaphysics of A Course in Miracles, that God created time.
So when Helen listened to that, she didn't listen correctly, because presumably Jesus didn't say that. Why would he have said that if it's...
Well, actually, if you know about the scribing process, basically he would say, give it the interdictation, she would write down shorthand, and one of the things she liked to do is she liked to do her own editing, so she would use different words than the words that Jesus used, and then she would find out down the line that it wasn't going to work, because he was consistent, and she was an obsessive editor. One time Ken Wapnick told me the story where he was going into her office where she worked to visit her, and she was on the phone talking with somebody, and so he waited for 5 or 10 minutes to see if she'd get off the phone, and she wasn't getting off the phone, so Ken decided he would just find a piece of scrap paper and scribble a little note for her and leave her the note. So he scribbled the note, he let it over there. Before he could get out of the room, he looked, he could see her editing his note. She was editing his scribble note that he had written. So there was some times where she wanted to get in and edit Jesus. At one point, she tried to mother Jesus. Her egoic, feminine motherliness came up, and she started to try to mother Jesus, and Jesus said, "I don't need a mother." Basically, let's get back to the notes. And you've seen that with animals, where sometimes they'll try to mother dogs or whatever will try to do that with other, it comes out. So there's all kinds of interesting quirks that came out with this, but basically, I would say that's what's so great about having these open communications, where we can learn and discern. The deeper we go together, we can learn what works, and we cannot get caught in distractions. I'd say there's a lot of stuff in the Urtext that was very helpful for me, although I didn't read it in the Urtext originally. I read it through Absence from Felicity and other places that were published, but now it's out there. Also, the Urtext and the Hugh and Casey version, some of the other ones were obtained illegally, in a sense that stolen from Edgar Casey's library in Virginia Beach and this and that. And so this is the way it goes with humankind. There's things that are going to spread, and the Course was kept together. It was copyrighted for that reason. Some people say, why would Jesus even instruct a copyright on such a profound thing? Was to really keep it together so it didn't get all splintered like the Scarecrow in the Wizard of Oz with the hay strewn all over the road, to really stay together as a practical tool. But I think it's best not to take any kind of stands around sexuality or things, just to start to understand what the metaphysics are teaching, and really just follow the instructions and apply the Course, and not get too distracted off onto areas about what does Jesus have to say about sexuality, and try to get some kind of a stand on the sexuality. For years, one of the ones that I admired, the teachers that I really admire a lot, was Krishnamurti. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Krishnamurti. But they would hound him decade after decade about sexuality. Like, come on, tell us. Is it helpful? Is it harmful? Tell us. And finally, he would say, have sex, don't have sex, but get on with it. I think he had one of the best answers. You see how he was so focused on the awakening, and how the mind, the ego mind, just wants to try to rivet on the human conditions and get a certain stand or a certain formula in terms of form, and really it's a transformation of consciousness that we're going through.
So ultimately, when you're ready to give it up, you'll give it up.
I think things, fall away quite naturally. It's not a matter of trying to lead with the form. I think things, just like with children's toys, they just lay them aside when they've been used.